Good morning, everyone. This is Nevin Gusak with New Ideas. With me is J.R. Nyquist, who's been a guest in demand lately regarding the geopolitical situation. Jeff is an author, a geopolitical analyst. Welcome back, Jeff. How you doing?
Hey Nevin, how's it going? Yeah, the situation is getting rather difficult to read. I even saw one of the people that I read, military historian, said there's no point to speculate about the situation because everything changes from day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to talk about the influences within the Trump administration. The last show we went into it, but we're going to focus in on the influence of the writer, and he was a bit of a tech software entrepreneur, Curtis Yarvin. He was a former libertarian. Now he believes in this idea of the cathedral, which I vociferously disagree with his political analysis. The cathedral, the idea that the media and the academics control the narrative in the country and are the real ruling class. I vociferously disagree with that. Anybody familiar with my show, my writings? He has some strange ideas. For example, interesting for someone who has read von Mises and Hermann Hoppe, he calls for, after the breakup of the United States, the nationalization of literally all property and then its divestiture or privatization back to the private sector, which kind of, strangely enough, when a state composed of individuals who believe in unaccountable power, whether unvarnished plutocracy or fascism or socialism or communism or Islamic economy on the other end, they don't tend to want to give up power, their wealth so easily. They generally don't divest that. They didn't do that in Russia under its fake privatization schemes during the 1990s, for example. He has called for the surrender of basically Europe to Russia, that is Yarvin, in a recent Substack piece that he wrote. These individuals are friends with tech billionaires who were present front and center at Trump's inauguration, like Mark Andreessen. You have J.D. Vance, the current vice president, as well as a number of other tech entrepreneurs. Peter Thiel, who at one time called for seasteads, where people who believe in his libertarian ideal can open seasteads. This was back around 2012, 2013, 2014. I actually saw him in person at a conference of the National Conservatism Conference and whatnot. And what's very strange is when I look, there are ideals I like about libertarianism in the general sense, politically and economically. But the concerns that I've developed over the years, and sometimes the subtext when I even talk with the libertarians, they seem to call for, either purposely or inadvertently, depending on the individual, a sort of corporate authoritarianism, which is as equally dangerous as collectivist state totalitarianism of socialism, communism, fascism, or fundamentalist Islam. Some of them have ties with China. Rick Perlstein, who is a liberal progressive journalist, when he was invited to a convocation, a dinner of tech entrepreneurs at Andreessen's house in San Francisco, they were praising the guests, including Andreessen, the Chinese Communist Party, and basically saying, well, why should the Chinese people fight for freedom and whatnot, taking a very dim view on that. So with that background, I'm going to let you comment on what you know, your interpretation, and why this is a danger for national security. Oh, we don't have your voice.
I'm sorry. Oh, that's a lot to take in. I've been looking at the way that the ideology on the right has shifted. You may remember, you may be too young to remember, there was a National Review and then there was the American Spectator, were these two right of center magazines back in the 1980s. And you had William F. Buckley, and you had a stable of writers, and the conservative movement, so called, which was really something that Ronald Reagan was really a part of, had a kind of uh, limited, had a definite way of describing reality and political reality. That was, if somebody started veering into anti-Semitism, if they started veering towards authoritarianism, they started veering away from what Russell Kirk would call the American conservative tradition, they were out. They were kind of excommunicated, you could say. And it was it was a, you could say it was a conservatism. It became a kind of ideology. A lot of people read National Review back then. I don't know if people do now. The magazine has changed, and the things you'll find in it are different. You had some intellectual heavyweights associated with it, people with real scholarship. I mean, Russell Kirk did some very interesting work, and the people that he was interested in fact, better than National Review, was a little thing called the University Bookman that came with National Review. It was a tiny little thing, and it had wonderful articles about culture and philosophy, and of course book reviews and so on. But this when I've looked at National Review since I stopped, because the thing that they got wrong was the fall of the Soviet Union. They thought they had actually defeated communism, which I knew they had not, and that they took it that way. They were giving themselves a win, and that was wrong. This proved there was a kind of hollowness in conservatism, that it had no discernment. It had, I think that it lacked what it claimed to have, which was unfortunate. So it has always been vulnerable. So once Buckley and these older writers and thinkers passed from the scene, Russell Kirk, others, you were left with, well, Pat Buchanan kind of emerged to be a political candidate, and you had a populist element, and there was always a kind of a working class, I guess you could say, feel to Pat Buchanan, so that everything, and of course his emphasis was on, well, there was a kind of a racial or ethnic emphasis. He didn't like the racial politics of the left. He did not like the open border, the wokeism in its earlier forms, well, as it was emerging. And of course, he was called a divisive figure. Now, when you get to, Nick Land wrote this book, The Dark Enlightenment, which is about Yarvin's, largely about Yarvin's Dark Enlightenment and what it means. And what he basically says is it's against two things. It's racial from the right, and it's anti-democratic, because and the anti-democracy comes from the libertarianism. So the libertarians became racial, you could say. What about the white guys? What if we do the same thing on the right that the blacks and other people are doing on the left? What if we celebrate whiteness the way they celebrate, black is beautiful or whatever? This was, of course, extremely controversial. And then when you go to the anti-democratic thing, Mencius Moldbug was the pen name that Curtis Yarvin was writing under. And of course, he declares himself a monarchist and a Jacobite. Jacobites are people who supported the Stuarts, who upheld absolute monarchy in Great Britain back in the 18th century. Charles I was a Stuart. He had his head chopped off. The second was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. They had a civil war and a revolution in the British Isles in the 17th century. So that was to go back to that, and then to quote Thomas Hobbes, who was the philosopher of monarchical absolutism, right? So this is very, very strange kind of writing to come on the right, and to start to have him be quoted by like Vice President Vance and Peter Thiel, who is also quoted in this book. Peter Thiel is a guy that sort of sponsored these tech funds in the West Coast that kind of Vance comes out of. And then you've got other figures. 2 years ago, on a talk show or on a podcast, Yarvin was talking to this British podcaster about well, Elon Musk being like a monarch, making the U.S. government more efficient, right? 2 years ago. So there's a funny thing where the themes, and of course, Moldbug was started writing, much more than a decade ago. This guy has been writing for a while. A lot of the quotes in this book are from 2004, 2005, and from people that are talking about these themes. And so this idea that the Constitution's obsolete, that it's about race from the right, and that it's not democratic, it's anti-democratic, is now, I think, we're seeing some of the things he talked about coming true. So and is it a coincidence, Nevin, you could tell me, that it appears the President of the United States, President Trump, is following ideas found in Yarvin, doing these things? Is that a coincidence?
Well,
And
it's not a coincidence what's going on with what appears to be largely the surrender of Ukraine, which, look, you and I are generally not quick to intervene in the world and nation build, but the loss of Ukraine, it really opens up potentially the influence of Russia throughout all of Europe, very similar to the way Southeast Asia fell to communism, South Vietnam.
Well, and it's more catastrophic because Ukraine is a country that is, despite the Russian talking points, is successfully resisting a Russian aggression. Ukraine has won battles against the Russians. They've held out against the Russians. But the Europeans, their military and industrial systems are so far away from being able to produce what Russia produces in a competitive sense, except for the country of Turkey, which is not really in Europe. Europe's up here, Turkey's down in Asia below the Black Sea. So Turkey, as the second strongest country in Europe, is not going to defend these other countries when it comes right down to it. They have to, and they don't. Turkey and the United States make up more than half the armed forces belonging to NATO. And the other countries are all, the other forces are divided between, 20 something odd other countries. And it's impossible that in their current state, if, for example, Ukraine was not there, if Ukraine was defeated, that they could stop the Russians easily. The Russians would have a chance to bully them into. So this is a very serious condition if the United States, as Elon Musk has called, withdraws from NATO.
Yeah,
it opens the gate. It opens the way to, World War III isn't very practicable until you get something like that, because then you give Russia a motive to start a larger war, because they really want to dominate Europe. They talk about it all the time. It's like an obsession. You find it in the Russian media, and you have Russian leaders saying, Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon, or the one common European home that Gorbachev and Yeltsin talked about. It's not a joke. This is their manifest destiny. And the Europeans know it. But the thing is, without America, practically speaking, America has technology and stuff that would allow the European countries to be able to defend successfully. You take that away, and the European possibilities for defense are lowered down like 2 notches, right? And it suddenly brings the Russians up to the point where they could use their air force. They could probably use thermobaric bombs or nuclear weapons to blast their way through the European forces. It's a very serious thing. And then you have in the Far East, Russia's ally China, and this theory of reversing Nixon and going after Russia to detach Russia from China, as if you could actually do something like that. And I don't think you can, because you can't, if someone's determined to be allies with somebody else because they have shared values or shared anti-values, you can't just step in and say, oh, well, what's your price? We'll buy you, we'll make sure you're our ally instead. I mean, that doesn't work with these people, because if you've studied totalitarianism, they're all anti-American, and they're all focused. The mature totalitarians are focused on the destruction of America. Hitler had contempt for America. He didn't think America was going to ever be anything of importance. But these more sophisticated totalitarians now, they know America is the country that's going to take them down, is going to destroy them in the end. So they want to destroy America first. And that's what people don't get. America is, if any country's going to be genocided, and the Ukrainians are, by the way, are threatened with a genocide because Putin denies Ukrainian nationality. He says there's no such nation, and he's going to rub them out. Well, these people like Putin and Xi Jinping in China, they literally want to destroy the United States. And I've heard this from the lips of defectors, and it's in the defector literature, and it's in their own, if you read between the lines in their own writings, in Chinese communist writings, in the writings of the Russian communists and the Putinists, you'll find it there.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
Americans, yeah, you got to, like Hannah Arendt said, you have to take them at their word. This is what they want to do. So yeah, this is why this is bad. And yeah.
Yeah, so to answer your question, not only do you have Ukraine, which dovetails what you have Yarvin, what he has called for in several articles on his Substack newsletter, calling for the surrender of Ukraine and just basically letting Russia dominate Europe. You have the Trump administration, with some exceptions, mostly calling for the surrender of Europe to Russia, and now making us deaf, dumb, and blind towards Russian cyber warfare. We've basically canceled efforts to monitor Russia's cyber warfare, and for us to launch cyber warfare against Russia too, especially if need be, as I'm sure you've heard. The other part is the whole Doge concept, which were led and initially formed by two individuals that are pro-Russia. One of the two individuals that are in bed with the CCP, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, Vivek is critical of the CCP. However, he is very much an apologist for Russia's actions in Ukraine. And Elon Musk, we know from his own posts on Twitter, he has made asinine comments, like one on Twitter that he recently pulled down. It was total bullshit, excuse the terminology, basically saying Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, they didn't call the shots. It was the public sector workers that actually did the executions. And, what they're trying to do is basically Doge is, and look, I am for efficient government. I am against government waste. The Heritage Foundation and other more mainstream conservative think tanks have cited for decades instances where I've seen figures of $100 million in government waste and redundancies. I'm not talking about programs. So there is something to be said about that. And this is even coming from me, and I've written about this on my Substack too. But with that stated, the whole purpose of Doge is to destroy the federal government and create something new, essentially. It parallels RAGE, which is Yarvin's acronym for Retire All Government Employees, which J.D. Vance explicitly backed in an interview about this before Trump was elected. And now what's going on is complete chaos. You have a lot of disgruntled government employees. We know that mainstream news has reported that Russia and China are both attempting to recruit these disgruntled employees, particularly ones that are from agencies that deal with American soft power, like USAID. And you have that door open not only to developing a revolutionary anti-capitalist consciousness amongst fired government workers, but also espionage operations by Russia and China. And that really plays into their hands because in a geopolitical sense, when you're trashing whatever abuses and corruption that may or may not exist within USAIDs and other organizations. I mean, I just saw in the news when I was at my girlfriend's this weekend that they're even taking down and downsizing or eliminating, it sounds like, Radio and TV Marti, which is beamed into Cuba. Now, what did our geopolitical adversaries say about Doge? Well, I've been using and totally geeking out on Grok on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I ask it, plus I've followed the press reports of this too. The communists are loving Doge. They are loving how American soft power is being destroyed. Belarus, Russia, Venezuela,
Well,
Hungary.
that's why the communists like libertarianism. They like libertarian. See, the thing is libertarianism, this anarcho-libertarianism, this left-wing anarchism, left-wing anarcho-capitalism. I met these people in the 1980s. I went to libertarian meetings. I was curious. I met Robert LeFay, who called me a barbarian at dinner. The anarcho-libertarian philosopher. I met these people, and they would be quoting Ayn Rand to you. They had this shorthand for the Austrian economists. They didn't really have a good political education or knowledge of history. And of course, what they were after was an interpretation of the world in which all government is bad. All of it is on a spectrum with totalitarianism. And of course, the United States government, they were willing to believe all these left-wing accusations that come from the communists against the U.S. government. And of course, government is a fearful master, as Washington said, and there are problems with it. But Hamilton was right. You have to have a strong federal government if you want to defend yourself against bad guys or against enemies. Let's say there's no bad guys or good guys. You have enemies who would want to destroy you, whether you want to morally judge them or not. You need to have a strong enough central government that defense becomes possible or effective. And that's one of the problems with libertarians, is that their vision of government, which is limited and small, is often too limited, too small, and too focused on consumption and consumerism for it to actually defend you against countries that have been turned into barrack states. Countries like China and Russia that can flip over to a war economy in a few, Russia's done it in 3 years, and suddenly be able to produce more ammunition than the whole, and artillery and weapons in the whole world put together. So Russia and China's this industrial giant. We've moved our industry there, and they made their industry dual purpose. So not only can they make toasters and refrigerators or whatever, they're also able to, and stoves, they're also able to turn it over and make armored personnel carriers and artillery and so on. And when it comes right down to it, these large military forces, which our leaders think are obsolete, they want these high-tech professional forces. When it comes right down to it, if you're going to use nuclear weapons, the older World War I type armies are fine, actually. Mm-hmm. And the Russians, you see the Russian army, why it got stuck in Ukraine is they couldn't use their nuclear component. So why is it artillery? That's a World War I weapon, howitzers. It's because that's what it is. It's made to work with nuclear weapons. And what's disturbing about that is Russia and China are building new nuclear weapons and missiles, and Trump wants to get rid of them. And these libertarians want to get rid of this. They don't care about the military-industrial complex, which no longer exists, by the way. It was destroyed at the end of the Cold War. These structures, which were supposedly so evil, kept us alive when the Soviet Union was aiming, thousands of nuclear warheads at us, which, by the way, the Russians and Chinese are now. And yet this thing is going away, this thing that protects us. And nobody wants to discuss it because Americans have this obligatory economic optimism boiled into their political speech. You can't say these things. Despair is a sin. Well, I'm sorry, it's not despair, it's just the facts. And you actually have to live in a factual, true world. And you have to deal with it, and that's your politics. You can't have politicians, well, we do, have politicians that come in and say, oh, no, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about this. And I have the answer. What do they mean they have the answer? There is no answer. If you don't have the weapons to defend, you can't defend. They will attack you and overrun you. But they won't. They're like children in their foreign policy, in the way they talk. And I call it rabble, like rabble rousing. But that's where we've come. And this is what bothers me about the Dark Enlightenment. And the thing is, these people, Mr. Nick Land and Mencius Moldbug, which is a creepy name, aka Curtis Yarvin, and people like Michael Malice, who wrote a history of from the fall of communism from this libertarian point of view in one of his books. And of course, Michael Anton, who wrote this book about how California is this horrible thing and we have to, we have to sort of storm the cockpit and stop the whole country from being turned into California. And of course, he's right. These guys are bright. They're very smart. They have beautiful ideas. But when you've got the Russian right-wing subversive intelligence officer, and I do call him that, Alexander Dugin, praising these people, praising Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, and you realize there's a structural similarity between Moldbug and Dugin. Dugin has created a system of scholars and agents, people who are following his Eurasianism, his perennialism, and his, underneath the esoterics of it, because there's an esoteric philosophy underlying it. And what he does is he trains, he's been going over, people don't realize, for like 25, 30 years, he has been recruiting people in all countries around the world. He's been recruiting them and educating them to this ideology that actually fits in with Russia and China taking over the world. This Eurasianism. It's if you examine it closely, that's what it is. And he's going for people on the right, whereas before the communists went for the left. Dugin's system, and the thing is, you can't recognize from one country to another. It doesn't look the same because it's adapted to each country's cultural and philosophic traditions or religious traditions. So when you get to Moldbug is adapted to the Silicon Valley libertarian thing, which has very much become a thing on the Republican right. You had Ron Paul, and we've got a senator from Kentucky, isn't Rand Paul from Kentucky?
Yes.
And the thing is that I met Ron Paul in April of 2001. We spoke at the same event. I did the lunch speech. He did the dinner speech for this group, and we met for coffee. And when I talked about Russia and China being a threat in the future, he just practically laughed in my face and said, no, the United States government is the big threat. Russia and China are, they're going to capitalism. For a libertarian, that's saying they're good, right? Not realizing that this is the tradition of totalitarian states, to have state capitalism. And it's really, that's what the communist system always has been. And they somehow think that there isn't an issue with them. The issue is to tear apart, as you say, the U.S. structured government. Our government, our trade system, our alliances are structured. They evolved out of World War II to defend us from the communists, because World War II ended and the Cold War began within a couple of years. You see, we realized we had another very serious threat in the Soviet Union. And now, after building the best enemy money could buy in China, by investing in China for 40 years, we've built up this country and we've transferred our industry to this country called China, which is a communist country. And now they're all in a panic. We have to do something. We'll just get Russia to counterbalance China. It's funny, at the same time they say Russia is not a serious power, they want to use Russia to counterbalance China. The fact is Russia and China are both serious powers. Russia actually has more power to destroy the United States today than China does. But together, what the GRU defector Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me was Chinese manpower and Russian missile power can defeat the United States in a war. And they don't seem to understand that this was determined. Russia and China, as Colonel Lunev testified, got together at the end of the Cold War, formed intelligence agreements and treaties, and formed an agreement for a future war to take down the United States and occupy North America. And so I don't know where these people are like fantasists. They're ideologists. And ideologists, they don't live in reality. They create a false reality or a second reality that people like to live in. There's something appealing in it, and they go for it, and they lie to themselves. And this lying to themselves or not knowing something and thinking you do, which is lying to yourself, is become so pervasive that you can't literally get people to talk realistically. I mean, you've got the crazy wokeism in the left with the open borders and the how many different sexes there might be. You've got that craziness, and then you've got this as a reaction to it, which is also wrong, the Dark Enlightenment. And so you have these two monsters, political monsters, and it doesn't seem you have a rational choice between the two now in American politics. And you're seeing it emerging in Germany with the AfD party, the Christian Democratic Union, the center-right party will not form an alliance with it. It's going to form an alliance with the Greens, is what it looks like. So what kind of a state do you have then when you have the crazy Greens aligned with the right, the center-right people? What kind of political? I don't understand. It's not coherent. You don't. And of course, how do you defend your society when nobody even sees the problem?
And you bring up a good point, and one of the points I wanted to mention before we kind of wrap up our conversation. I'm glad you're bringing this up, and I'm glad you brought up Dugin. Dugin, as you know, in Foundations of Geopolitics, is 1997's one of his main seminal works, calls for tearing up the United States by extremist groups playing on cultural, racial, and other divisions in the United States. And Yarvin, incidentally, calls for the abolition of the United States and the creation of these sort of mini techno-feudal kingdoms, if you will, or governments where each part of the United States would be governed by a CEO monarch. I believe that's his term exactly.
Yeah.
So that works for Russia and China because you have a broken up United States. And look, I mean, I have nothing against billionaires because they have a lot of money and more stuff. My issue is their political influence and how they make their money and whatnot. And abuse.
Well, the problem is that they will open up the United States to being totally dominated by Russia and or China.
Precisely, because many, not all, but many, as you have seen personally, and I have seen to a lesser extent that type of corruption, are staunch advocates for trade with Russia and China whenever there are issues of, I remember the debate for permanent normal trade relations for China. I even wrote an editorial for our local newspaper here in Broward County, Florida, Sun Sentinel, and I wrote an editorial opposing it, and it got published. And I remember watching the debates on C-SPAN, and all the big business groups, they all lined behind China, knowing damn fucking well, pardon my language, excuse me, that trade with China was a national security disaster. The information was known to them. It was a human rights disaster, and all the rest of it. Still state-dominated economy, despite the quote-unquote reforms. They knew, they just don't care. Now, my time with the libertarians, I've also encountered libertarians too as well. I went to a conference with my friend Miles Canner of the Ludwig von Mises Institute back in the winter, spring of 2000. And I remember even having a really wonderful history professor who's now deceased, Bill Marina, one of the most student-friendly professors I had. He was a libertarian. We took several classes with him, been to his house. I voted libertarian in the year 2000 for the Libertarian Party, but what set me off rethinking libertarianism, where there was a number of things. And mind you, there are things I agree with them on, certain historical interpretations. They have some cutting edge thought. Was when my friend, Miles Canner, he's a writer, and he also works in business insurance now. And one of his essays, I think it was in frontpagemag.com, criticizing Harry Browne, who was the Libertarian Party chairperson and presidential candidate for 2000. He criticized Browne for blaming the 9/11 attacks on our foreign policy, and Miles Canner wrote an article condemning that. And what happened was, Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com, who is an apologist for every dictator under the sun, he's now deceased, and Jeremy Sapienza of the now defunct website antistate.com, was more of a local down here in Florida, condemned it in the most harshest possible terms. And part of the libertarian movement went after him viciously. And I thought, these are individuals that are for free inquiry and measured debate and being rational, and they're acting, I remember telling myself, these are acting like the worst elements of the far left, the anti-capitalists that they opposed. I'm like, there must be something to this. So I started to rethink it. And it's a shame. There are a few people in the libertarian movement historically that have opposed this. John Hospers in the 1970s resisted this sort of Soviet apologist, anti-Cold War attitudes within the Libertarian Party. They were eventually purged by 1977. The Libertarian platform reflected a very anti-defense Soviet apologetics type of view, not supporting their economic system, but their foreign policy justifying it. And that was, of course, we should quickly mention Murray Rothbard, who was an economics professor and longtime libertarian. He was an early opponent of America's effort to protect itself against communism abroad. He wrote pieces under the pseudonym Aubrey Williams as far back as in the 1950s, and actually William Chamberlain really pushed back. One well-known anti-communist conservative intellectual, I believe his name is William Chamberlain, wrote an article in the New Leader pushing back against that type of thinking as far back as the 1950s. I came across Grok, J.B. Matthews, who used to be a leftist, who then worked as one of Joe McCarthy's aides after repudiating communism, wrote an article back before the American Mercury magazine turned into an anti-Jewish racist screed. He wrote in the mid-50s an article criticizing the free marketeers within the Mont Pelerin Society for permitting free trade with red countries, as he termed it. The article was Free Market Illusions. So this kind of push-pull within the conservative and right-wing movement of conservatives and libertarians of different stripes has been going on a long time. To comment about National Review, I used to read it in my high school library, all the back issues, that and the Reader's Digest in the library, while I wasn't talking and hanging out with my friends. National Review had a lot of good articles, and you're correct. They did marginalize figures that were real or allegedly anti-Jewish or fascist-adjacent individuals. The John Birch Society, notably, Joe Sobran, if you remember Joe Sobran, I'm sure.
I do, yes. That was very controversial at the time when Buckley denounced him, yes.
Oh, yeah, and American Spectator, that was R. Emmett Till's publication. So, yeah, there were a lot of these tensions. I think, look, there are libertarians that have contributed some cutting-edge arguments, cutting-edge historical arguments. Walter Williams first opened my eyes in his book, South Africa's War Against Capitalism, that apartheid, contrary to what some people say, was an Afrikaner nationalist construct, that it was actually in its early stages and even later stages, by the definition that I would use, and I think you would use, very socialistic orientation, and whatnot. Joe Stromberg talked about South Vietnam's economic controls. You had a lot of libertarians that brought up some very interesting historical arguments, which
Of course, these were countries that were under siege, both
correct.
The Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and South Africa were countries that were under siege by communists. And the countries of that kind, and the same thing for South Korea through much of its history, tended towards authoritarian governments that had more control over the economy. And of course, in a way, they had to because of the infiltration of the economy by communists and subversives. And you see what's happened in South Korea since they became more liberal. You've got virtual takeover of their left of center party by people who want to merge the country with North Korea. Now, to some extent, I was surprised at this development in South Korea, but it's true. Once you start softening and start talking about trading with the communists, and once you open your economy to them, it's not long after they turn that in the universities, which are always filled with this, it seems, communism. You turn the country into something on the left that's willing to do what the communists want.
Well, and that also calls into question the role of the government and the economy for national security. Before we wrap up and we get some closing comments, these governments, and I've studied them, even interlibrary loan, there are published statements translated in English, others that I translated into English using Google Translate on my phone, and doing a lot of deep research on Grok, which pulls up all kinds of obscure documents with citations. I've been reading about it for 20 years. They definitely were under siege. Their relationships with the communist countries are very complicated under apartheid. And South Korea.
Yeah, fighting communism effectively is a problem that has not been solved, except by these kind of regimes, which are basically able to hold the line as long as they exist. But then the call for democracy and liberalization ultimately leads them in a dangerous direction of allowing flirtation with communist, as you'd say, Nazi adjacent, communist adjacent ideologies or thoughts. And that is a problem. What do you do? And of course, this is the thing. People misunderstand democracy. It should be an element in a system of checks and balances, but in the West, we've turned it into a god, democracy.
Yeah, democracy is a good thing, but like anything else in excess, it tends to be problematic, and that's something that
it needs to be part of a constitution. But remember, in American democracy, the people only have their say on what is it, the second Tuesday or the first Tuesday in November every other year for Congress, and every 4 years for president, every 6 years for a Senate seat. It's not a lot of democratic choice when you come down to it.
Well, like anything else in excess, you can't have everything too much in either way. But getting back to and I don't want to get into the weeds. I mean, we got to do a whole show on this point. A lot of these so-called, I call them right-wing collectivist authoritarians, when you look, irrespective of their views of communism, they were confronted with issues of developing their economies. It just depends on the country. South Africa, they admired National Socialism. This was before the Republic of South Africa became the Republic. They thought that these governments would basically were effective systems for national development, national discipline, and whatnot. When it comes to their relations with communist countries, there was also a large dose of pragmatism, and I've written a lot about this. It's fascinating. Like the Republic of South Africa had very close economic relations with Frelimo Mozambique. Why? For example, because of pragmatism. Before Mozambique was basically, the Portuguese were basically pushed out because of the AFM, which was communist dominated in Portugal, that overthrew the fascist governments of Salazar and Cayetano, pushed them out. South Africa had arrangements with the gold mines. Gold miners and Mozambican labor came to South Africa to mine the gold. That was continued because that was hard currency for Mozambique. A great Grok quote that I felt on that psychotic communist dictator, Samora Machel, who was the one of the leaders of Free Limo, said
Yeah.
basically South Africa's diamonds are financing the bullets. South Africa has had during from the 50s, and especially 60s, 70s, and 80s, had a lot of covert trade relations with East Germany, Romania, China. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And when you delve, as I'm sure you know this, Jeff, when you delve into a lot of this history and really geek out on Cold War history, you find a lot of a wilderness of mirrors, really. And I think what you're saying, though, is correct. When these governments liberalize into more of a liberal democracy, which I do support, you still have to have controls. You still, and this is a lesson for America, you have to have strong national security controls. Something that our friend Trevor Loudon always says, and our Constitution in the preamble stipulates this: common defense and domestic tranquility. That's national security. That's the first job and the most important job of the federal government. And that's a lesson that Western quote unquote democracies or republics, we really have to get that back into our DNA. That's kind of my closing comment. Do you have any closing comments?
No, well, yeah, you'll notice that a lot of these tech right people, they don't talk about the Constitution that much, or at all. They're not really, the libertarian ideology is therefore the communists like it because they know it's going to break us down. And this is the thing that people have to be aware. We need to uphold traditions and not only traditions, folkways, beliefs, and habits, and alliance structures and trade structures that have served us well in the past. Let them evolve slowly. You know, the old conservatism is don't have a revolution, don't change everything, don't reinvent the wheel. What you have has served you well. Stick by it, make little changes and see how it is, but be very cautious. You have to be, politics is extremely complicated. And for you to think you can with your own head think up an ideology and remake everything, it's very dangerous. And this is what the administration today appears to be doing.
Yeah, I agree. And what we see is a scissor strategy. We see major communist groups like the Party of Socialism and Liberation. I mean, I don't even understand why they always call themselves liberation. It just makes me sick. I mean, it's doublethink, as George Orwell talks about in his book 1984. You have the Party of Socialism and Liberation, whose head used to have a program on Russia's Sputnik, Brian Becker. They're very closely tied with the Cubans and the Venezuelans, amongst other governments. There are apologetics for China. They're in the streets protesting Trump's immigration policies, all the rest of it, using what may seem to be, quote, good causes, social justice to mask a hidden agenda. And now you have these, quote, tech billionaire funded, quote unquote, right wingers or neo reactionaries or NRX people, as I think that's the acronym, coming from the right, dismantling our soft power and also creating geopolitical problems for the long-term survival of the United States, withdrawing and breaking up the NATO alliance, potentially us not having any commitments to Taiwan, which are being hinted. And look, I'm not a warmonger, nor are you. Look, we have to be prepared for war. This is something George Washington talks about. You don't fight battles, but in order to keep the peace, prepare for war. Or one of my heroes, Teddy Roosevelt, has said, walk softly, but carry a big stick. And, that's pretty much my policy recommendation. I outline that in my sensible defense policy piece that I wrote in Substack some months ago. So, but I think you're 100% right. And what we're seeing is a scissor strategy, whether conscious or unconscious, PSL from the left, NRX, neo-reactionaries, tech billionaire, quote unquote, right-wingers coming from the other side. And that's all fulfilling Putin and the old Soviet dream, and now United Russia and Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev and others of United Russia, their dream of breaking up the United States and collapsing it so they can basically move in for the kill. And that's closing comment.
Yeah, that's right.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Jeff. Where can people find your work or your published works, please?
jrnyquist.blog and Amazon. You can go to the JR Nyquist page on Amazon.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll have you back in the near future. Take care. God bless.
Thank you.
Okay.